So, welcome everybody. First of all, apologies for the delay. These things happen. They didn't used to happen when we were all virtual, but now that we are recovering, they are telling me you don't hear me well now? Better? Okay. So, welcome to this second debate of our program, Defense and Me 2.0. As some of you may know, here in La Complutense and there, all the students of Pompeu Fabra, which I also welcome. This program was launched last year in collaboration with the Embassy of the United States and esglobal, and our aim was to foster the culture of defense among Spanish students, university students. It couldn't be more timely, and this year we had decided to do it again, thanks again to the support of the embassy, and unfortunately we are all talking about these issues today. I say unfortunately because we would have liked to be in another environment, but we will be speaking about the topic today. For that, again, we are joining forces together with 15 universities, public universities in Spain. As you also know, this program has two parts, this series of debates along which we want to cover different aspects of defense and security, considering that security goes beyond military force and so on. We all know that there are new threats going around. But this year particularly, we want to focus on NATO because, as you all know, at the end of June, there will be a summit here in Madrid in which the new strategic concept of NATO will be discussed and approved. And in the meantime, we are also hearing a lot about NATO because of the need to cover Western defense these days. The second pillar of this program is the competition to which you are all invited. For that competition, we are asking you to present ideas, proposals on how you see any of these topics, be it in written, podcasts, videos, different formats, and you know there will be one winner per university. At the end of this first round of comments here, we will have the participation of one of the winners of last year, but we want to invite you very seriously to participate in this program. The prize is a trip to Brussels to visit NATO headquarters and other institutions related to security and defense. Just my last point here, I want to introduce our speakers today. I want to thank, very thankfully, Theresa Fallon, who's the founder and director of the Center for Russia, Europe and Asia Studies in Brussels. Thank you, Theresa, for being here. Of course, I want to thank you, our host, David García Cantalapiedra, professor here at the Complutense University and also an expert in security and defense issues. And of course, I also want to thank Josep Ibáñez at the Universidad Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, which is online with us, and also want to, again, welcome his students, who's also a professor there at the university and an expert in global governance, security, and defense issues. A couple of remarks about the dynamics of the session. We will be having a conversation here about NATO, China, Russia, and the international order, and then we'll give you the floor to all the students here and there on screen virtually, all of you who are attending this event virtually. I also invite you to participate, to take the floor, to share with us your comment, questions, and concerns. And without further ado, Theresa, please, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon. And I'm so glad to be here in person and not in a Zoom room, so I'm delighted to see all of you. I think this is such a fascinating topic, and I'm honored that your professors have put these three words together, NATO, China, and Russia. Many of you might not have thought of those three together. I've been really fortunate that I lived in Russia and China back to back, and that's such an unusual experience because it led me to see a lot of similarities between Russia and China. And I loved both countries so much. My children grew up in both of them, and I have such fond memories. I don't know how many photo albums my boys are in China because they were photographed often, and they just grew up speaking the language, and they continue with their studies in Chinese. So I want to begin my opening remarks at a time of great concern for all of us with the war in Ukraine, and I want to ask, how did we get here? That's probably what's on all of your minds. So we only have a couple minutes, so I'll keep it short and sweet. The narrative that Ukraine was going to join NATO, I think, is kind of part of Putin's misinformation campaign. Everyone knows that any country that is in a conflict cannot join NATO. So in 2008, we saw at the opening of the Olympic ceremony, Putin invaded Georgia, thus creating a frozen conflict, and therefore Georgia could no longer even be considered as a possible candidate country for NATO. The same thing in Ukraine with what happened in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. So these are frozen conflicts. They effectively took Ukraine out of the narrative. It could never become a member of NATO as long as there was a conflict going on there. And in addition to that, we've seen, for example, there's a group called the 17+1. It's a strategic corridor in Central and Eastern Europe. It's made of 11 EU member states and 5 possible accession states, plus Greece, which is like this land-sea corridor. So we see this interesting land-sea corridor that China has kind of carved out, a sub-regional grouping within Europe between a very strategic corridor between Europe and Russia. And when I would go to Russia and do interviews, I would ask, how do you feel about China's influence in this very strategic corridor? And they told me, as long as China stays out of Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, it's fine. Those are smaller countries. They're not as of great interest to us as those 3. So Ukraine was definitely on their list. And many years ago, we saw, well, not many years ago, China has been a big investor in Ukraine. Prior to what happened with the annexation of Crimea, they had inked the largest land lease deal in history, because that would contribute to their food security. As all we know in Europe, it's the breadbasket of Europe. In addition, they could buy technology from Ukraine that they couldn't buy from Russia. And they also trained PLA soldiers in Ukraine. In addition to that, they sold the first aircraft carrier that China ever had, and China asked that it be described as a casino, because you couldn't have towed this huge aircraft carrier through the straits. So it's very important to remember that Ukraine actually contributed to China's first aircraft carrier called the Liaoning. So there's a very interesting relationship that I think many people aren't familiar with China's interest in Ukraine. Second, China. What is China's role in all of this? We saw on February 4th before even the Beijing Olympics began, Xi Jinping and Putin met in Beijing, and they signed an agreement, a 5,000-word agreement. Some have described it as a non-aggression pact, similar to the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. And so, after that was signed and agreed, President Putin was able to move Russian soldiers that are in the Far East over to Ukraine. So this kind of agreement between China and the Kremlin, Beijing and the Kremlin, allowed Putin to move troops. In addition to that, the narrative is growing that China had no idea what was going to happen. But in the statement, it's the first time it was actually made public, and it's published, you can all find it online, that Beijing and Moscow would work together to push against NATO. So I think that that's a really important point, that they saw that the West, they're not happy with NATO, and they're trying to push back on the West. There are many things else that are outlined in this agreement, and kind of mutually beneficial support. They also agreed to a giant pipeline and also to new markets. So I think that this sent a signal to the West that if there were going to be sanctions on Russia, China would provide a cushion for them. So there is this element of cooperation, and of course they wore matching outfits to kind of highlight that they were all on the same page. They twinned their outfits. So this bromance between Xi and President Putin is quite interesting. They describe it as the best relationship Russia-China has had in 300 years. So I think that this is really important in regard to the geopolitical tectonic plates that are moving as we speak. So what are the consequences of all this? This is a real challenge to the rules-based order. Some are seeing it as, the hardening of the contours of the international order, where we see autocracies versus democracies, or countries that are trying to test the limits of the rules-based order. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, both Russia and China were party to that. They were at the table. They negotiated it together among other countries. And it's one of the most signed documents in the world. So for the UN, this is one of the most important documents. Nevertheless, even after the arbitral tribunal decision in 2013 of China versus the Philippines, China decided to ignore this ruling. So we see that the rules-based order is kind of one set of rules for the immediate neighborhood of China and another set of rules for the international order. For example, this will come into play in the Arctic. With global warming, we're seeing the northern route is becoming more important. This will shave off days of transport. So when you're doing logistics for moving ships and cargo across the world, that saves companies a lot of money. So this will become a very important strategic economic waterway, in addition to for military reasons. So whoever can get control of that or has input into that region, it's very key. And then what else? What are the consequences of what's happening to this? Now, we see that there's increased activity in Ukraine. It's becoming horrible by the day. But there are about 5 nuclear plants in Ukraine. So if in the fog of war a missile hits one of these plants, it will affect everyone in Europe. This will be terrible. And recently, one of the missiles came extremely close to a nuclear plant based in Ukraine. In addition to that, Chernobyl, where there was a nuclear accident in the 80s, now that there are heavy tanks there, they're kind of moving all the earth, and we're seeing higher points in radiation. So we've seen Europe's response at first was initially rather flaccid, but we've seen them ratcheting up their sanctions. So I would describe this as a new era in Europe. Germany has announced that they're going to meet their 2% figure for GDP for defense spending. Now, this was agreed way back in 2006. All members of NATO have agreed to this, but Germany was unable to meet that. And most recently, it was about 1.5%. Now they're pledging to meet at least 2%. So this is a sea change for European security. Okay. And so I think we tend to think of every strategist's dilemma is a two-front war. So we saw this in World War II. And ideally, people would just like to have one theater of war. But what we're seeing with this kind of Russia-China détente, or entente, I should say, is that in a strategic triangle, when you have Russia, China, and the US, with Russia and China increased cooperation, it makes it very complicated. So this means that Europe needs to step up to the plate, be more active in their own region, so the US can actually do more in the Asia-Pacific region, plus they still need to keep an eye on what's happening in Europe. So all things are no longer regional. We are seeing a more geopolitical region, especially with what like Mackinder, the father of geopolitics, would describe the world island, the Eurasian. So we have problems on each end of the Eurasian continent. So this will be quite a challenge for all of us. This is what our future looks like. This is the new era that we're in. And what we've seen is some of the unintended consequences of Putin's actions in Ukraine mean that traditionally neutral countries like Switzerland have decided to impose sanctions. That was unheard of. And Sweden and Finland, also neutral countries, you might have read in the press recently that Russian planes flew over Sweden. Sweden is a partner of NATO, but it's not a member. So therefore, what's happening in Ukraine could actually happen to Sweden. So these countries are rethinking their neutrality. They're getting off the fence because of the new strategic landscape that they're living in. And I think that NATO offers an insurance policy. That's why after the demise of the Soviet Union, Ukraine voted. 91% of the population of Ukraine voted to leave the Soviet Union. So it wasn't an attractive power, and the way Putin is trying to get in there now is through sheer brute force. So this is kind of the Hobbesian world that we're in. We're not following the rules-based order any longer. It's really a world of might makes right. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Theresa, for this overview of how things are and where we can from. I'm sorry I forgot to tell, not you here at the room, but people watching on the screen, that if you want to watch this debate in Spanish, you have the choice to turn into the Spanish channel. So please follow that if you prefer. Let me now give the floor to Josep and see how he sees this state of things and the world order in general.
Okay, thank you, Cristina. And thank you so much for organizing this program and for hosting sessions like this. At the Universidad Pompeu Fabra, we are delighted to collaborate once more with esglobal and with the US mission in Spain, both the embassy in Madrid and the Consulate General in Barcelona. And well, going directly to the point, let me share some thoughts about this extremely large topic we have today. And I would just make 4 points. The first one would be to consider the evolution of international order and how it is articulated with the power structure, how norms and institutions are related with the distribution of capabilities among international actors. A very basic fact of international politics is that institutions must reflect the power of those who create them. Otherwise, they are doomed to disappear. So one of the main purposes of institutions is to maintain stability, to reproduce the status quo, to serve the preferences of the powerful, and they can evolve, and they do evolve, but institutions cannot be decoupled from power. And the point is that the evolution of international order by the beginning of the 21st century has been perceived differently by different great powers. From its origins in 1945, this order reflected the preferences of the great powers of the time, but the power distribution among states has evolved dramatically in such a way that there has been a partial decoupling from international order. In other words, the current international order does not reflect the values, preferences, and power capabilities of states like China or India. And also the power of states like the Russian Federation has maybe decreased in relative terms. And what is most important, Russia perceives that international order somehow curtails its possibilities to regain or to maintain its great power status of the past. My second point is that this dissatisfaction of some great powers with some of the main institutions of international order results in contestation, rogue behavior, and in increasing demands for change by some states. Right? This is what China and Russia stated, as Theresa Fallon has pointed out some weeks ago. And in that document, in that joint statement, some points were extremely relevant. Their shared support for democracy and human rights, but interpreted, in the way everyone would like to interpret them, because there is not one single model of democracy, is a very key point, a relevant point. Their interest in intensifying their economic cooperation in several regions like Eurasia, the Indo-Pacific, and the Arctic is another very good point, very interesting point. And as pointed out before, it is from the perspective of NATO and Western countries, it is very interesting to see how they stated their common opposition to any sort of interference by Western powers in the internal affairs or in the security of other states. Some explicit references to the non-enlargement of NATO or the Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan were prominent, but also implicitly, these also entail that Western powers shouldn't be involved in domestic issues of countries like Ukraine or Georgia, or in other issues affecting Xinjiang or Hong Kong from the Chinese side. However, and this is my third point, such an intent or such understanding between these two powers is far from anything similar to an alliance or a truly firm commitment to defend each other's views or interests. I think the ambiguity of China in relation to the situation in Ukraine illustrates the uneasiness of explicitly supporting a power which is seen somehow as a subversive actor. What Russia has done is very radical in terms of subverting the order and some of the provisions of the UN Charter. Their demands for a new world order, because of China and Russia, they've been put forward or channeled very differently. I would say that in the case of China, we've seen how the government has somehow adapted to the evolving international order, and of course it has questioned some of its norms and institutions, but somehow it also has offered alternative frameworks and arrangements which are, for some developing countries in particular, are appealing. Some developing countries are kind of dissatisfied with the Western liberal institutions, and they find some appeal in initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and also in some normative concepts such as the so-called Beijing Consensus, as opposed to the Washington Consensus. We may assess them as we wish, but the thing is that some of these proposals are attractive for some audiences, right? And here there is maybe a contrast with the case of Russia, because the dissatisfaction and contestation of Putin's government has not been translated into normative or institutional attractive proposals for its neighbors beyond the area of the former Soviet bloc. Instead, Russia has behaved according to a mindset and to an understanding of the world which seems to me somehow anchored in the 19th century or in the beginning of the 20th century. And, you know, the world has changed in many ways, and it has experienced revolutions of all sorts. And still, the current Russian government behaves as if the bottom line of international politics continued to be only great power politics, the struggle for power, and competition for spheres of influence, like in the interwar period, you know, with the doctrine of the great spaces proposed by some ideologues of the German Empire then. And my fourth and last point has to do with NATO. Very briefly, I think very clearly NATO is in a critical moment in its history. There has been other moments in which critical crossroads were in front of the alliance, and in particular during the 90s, it was necessary to redefine or rebuild or reinvent the alliance, and such reinvention took place through two simultaneous processes, having to do with, on the one hand, the geographical enlargement towards Eastern Europe, and on the other hand, the strategic enlargement or material enlargement with a broader multidimensional definition of security, including non-military risks and threats, and also coming from non-state actors. But you know, the situation now entails that these critical moment will have to be translated into statements in the new strategic concept that will be adopted in June 2022 in Madrid. In particular, I think it is very important to pay attention to the definition of China as a systemic as a systemic challenge for the first time, and the design of a strategic posture towards risks and threats in the Indo-Pacific region. Also, I think it will be a key to define a strategic posture towards the east of Europe and the threat of Russia, especially considering the current situation. We'll see how this will evolve, but this will be a key issue for sure. Another key issue is to consider the enlargement and consolidation of a strategic definition of security with non-military challenges, climate change, cyber attacks, you name it, which requires political responses more than operational responses in some cases, And also, I think from a European perspective, I think it is quite important to consider how the relationship between NATO and the European Union will be defined or articulated. I think some sort of strategic alignment is needed, and especially considering that the majority of members of both organizations are the same states, and the environment, the geopolitical environment is what it is. So this will be a very difficult challenge for the alliance, and I think that at least the 4 points that I've mentioned stress the relevance of the geopolitical moment we are living, and that was so even before the war in Ukraine. If we put this new situation in the equation, then the challenge is enormous. It is huge, and we will have the opportunity to discuss some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josep. It's amazing because we've seen the revival of NATO several times in the last 2 decades. Just a few months ago, we were asking ourselves whether that could be the end of NATO, especially after the exit from Afghanistan, as it was made, and suddenly it gains again all this importance for the security and defense of the Western world. Let me now give the floor to David. Many issues have been raised, and I'm sure we will have time for discussion, but first, let's hear you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very grateful to be here again. Thank you to esglobal, Cristina, as usual, to the American Embassy in Madrid, and to you, Theresa, for coming to Madrid in this no very good weather we have in Madrid right now. I'm going to be very straight in certain issues. I usually prepare a PowerPoint, and my students, when knew that, start to run away from me, because, but I'm going to be straight, and I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 issues, because I would like to discuss a little bit about that, and I'm going to move a little bit between this academic point of view, conceptual point of view, and also the think tank point of view, if you want to say, because I have a great colleague here talking about from this point of view, another great colleague from the academic point of view talking in Barcelona. And but also I would like to thank Raquel for coming, and his class now already is Security in International Relations and Introduction to International Relations, and all my students here. Thank you very much for the effort, and thanks to you, Raquel, for coming. Well, first of all, I would like to center my comments in 3 points. No? Of course, we already have been talking about that. This is the end of the liberal international order, and we know it. Probably, well, we maintain it in a certain way, but it's not the international liberal order we had during the 90s or the first 20th century, 1st century. Probably we had to adapt to that. No? This is really a situation we are going to live with during the following years. Because there are 2 countries don't want to maintain this system, that is China and Russia, and other countries around, rogue states, whatever you want to say. But that is a certain issue to talk about in the future, but for me it's very clear, and I'm not going to talk now about that more. And the other 2 issues are more regarding my classes and discussions. And finally, I will talk about a little bit about NATO. First of all, I would like to talk about what happened in Europe. You know? What happened in Europe the last years? Well, in fact, the post-Cold War security order that we live in during 20 years, it was very good for us. That's with a certain treaties, certain agreement with the Russians and us, has disappeared. Now, treaties of nuclear disarmament, ENF, disappeared. The Convention of Forces Europe Treaty has disappeared. No one is respecting now the Helsinki Act of 1975. And then for us, all this strategic building we live in has disappeared. Then we had to learn that it has been changed, and this is not coming again to be in Europe, at least for a lot of years. Then, from that point of view, I think the NATO and even the European Union and the allies had to a wrong position during the beginning of the 21st century. I remember when I was involved in the review of the last, on the creation of the last strategic concept in 2010, and the decisions about all in the nuclear aspect. You know, this for me was not a clear position by the Allies, reducing nuclear arsenal in Europe. Meanwhile, Russia, China, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and other countries raise the value of nuclear weapons in his strategic policy. Well, this is another one example we can talk about later. And the ideas surrounding that, now, deterrence, compellence. These two concepts, I remember still the former Mogherini, the former vice president of the Commission and a high representative, talking in Washington saying deterrence is something from the past. Well, this was completely wrong, as we saw now in Europe. Now, precisely the problem with Russia has been a problem of deterrence and the failure of deterrence. No, there was the European allies, the United States has not been credible enough to avoid that Russia invade Ukraine. We can talk about other things, of course, that provoke that behavior from Russia, but to the end, this is one of the main issues, at least talking about from the NATO point of view. Third, I think we have to talk a little bit about China. Probably China is the long-term challenge, or even the long-term problem from Western countries, from NATO, and from United States, and the Western world as a whole. Why? Well, I think China is in the process, or has been in the process during the last 25 years, trying to change the international liberal order and have a clear strategy to do that. Probably the most interesting is the so-called three warfare or three wars strategy. It is very interesting to analyze because it's a psychological warfare, a legal warfare, and a media warfare. Then we have a lot of samples to talk about that, but probably it's something that the people don't take into account, and sometimes I talk with my students about this, and the samples we can recover from the networks very, very, very easy. I have some examples in my PowerPoint, but if it's necessary, I'm going to use it. Even using things like movies or comics, it's very simple to understand that, and we are going to see how China has been behaving in the last years. Of course, we can talk about more issues. And finally, about NATO. Probably, and this is very interesting because the last time I was talking about NATO profoundly and very seriously was in Washington, in Georgetown University, with Professor Jervis, the late Professor Jervis. He died 1 month ago, and it was amazing because Professor Jervis said NATO is obsolete, and he said, Professor Jervis, you cannot say that. Yeah, you know, it's this kind of NATO is obsolete. We need a new NATO, and we had to change NATO. And it's a pity Professor Jervis is not going to see how NATO is going to change in the next strategic concept, for sure. we are going to see a huge change about all because the policy of the allies, the main allies, the United States, probably because of Germany too. We can talk about that also. And I'm going to stop here because we can talk more about all these issues later, and very happy to respond to your questions, whatever. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. As he just said, there are many questions on the table, but let me ask you, all the three of you, a single question, each to one, and then, of course, you are. If you want to reply, if you want to add any comment or remark, please do it. And I also invite Professor Raquel Barras to join the conversation. First, let me ask Theresa. You've talked about China, and well, by the way, I invite all of you to read this document. This is a statement being published after the meeting of Xi Jinping and Putin, because I think it's a very good example of a redefinition of the world order. And as you said, as Josep said, how they redefine the concept of democracy and human rights, for instance. They use the same concepts that we've always defended, but of course the meaning of that is completely different, and that is very, very saying for all of us. You've described how China has gotten here and its role and its relationship with Ukraine and so on. We've seen how ambiguous it's been for the last days, but yesterday we had the news that it may seem that China wanted to act as a mediator. Until now, it had stood apart from any other thing. I would think that China has two choices now: either to really stand up to a new kind of global power hegemon, if we want, stating how China wants to play that role, or being part of these rogue players, the rogue actors, and really putting aside together with Russia in a very bad concept of new world order. I don't know whether I'm clear now. You know, I think with this mediation, with this, if it really takes up a role in making things a little bit better, it has an hegemon role. But if it decides to stay with Russia, then it's another future. What do you think? What's China going to do, in your view?
That's such a good question and timely question, and this would pick up on your three warfares point, because China wants discourse power. They want to control the narrative, and that's really key for them. So the fact that they met in Beijing on February 4th, signed this document, they, unlike in 2008, in the opening of the Olympics, Russia invaded Georgia. So this time they waited out of courtesy to do it after the Olympics. And we saw before the invasion, the oil price was rising. It was hitting about $95 a barrel. You don't usually fill up your strategic petroleum reserve. It's called the SPR. You wait until the oil price is really low. Nevertheless, China started filling their oil reserves at $95 a barrel because they had a tip-off that this war was coming. That's my analysis of it. And in addition to that, they also bought huge amounts of grain from Russia. So there are issues about their own food security. They understood things were going to get bad in Ukraine. Ukraine is a huge exporter of grain. They're known as the bread basket here in Europe. So their actions, to me, kind of tip off that that's what they understood from Putin, that they were going to do this. They hadn't, Xi Jinping has been in China for 2 years. Because of COVID, he has not traveled anywhere. Putin as well, as we've seen with those meetings at the long table and with even his advisors are about the last row in the room here. So I think that there's a danger of kind of an echo chamber, that they're surrounded by advisors that think like him or echo or tell him what they want to hear. I think it's true of both leaders here. So I think this is a problem for us here in the West. And many analysts, some people were speculating that if something happens in Ukraine, then this would give China the opportunity to do something in Taiwan. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen right now, but we've seen that reported in the press. So that's every strategic planner's nightmare, this kind of coordination between Russia and China, so that one theater is taken up with the world's attention in Ukraine, and then something would happen in Taiwan. And by the way, this morning I woke up to a tweet that said all the electric grid was out in Taiwan, and I thought, no, but that was just it. The electric grid went out. Sometimes things are just a cigar. But I should say that in all of this, China wins no matter what, because Russia, as we saw after what happened in Crimea and sanctions, even though they weren't very strong sanctions, Russia turned toward China because they needed China's support, and they wanted to show the rest of the world China is backing us. Russia's exports of energy, 20% of them go to China, 45% go to Europe. So Europe is a really key market for them. China is a big exporter. They need to have good relations with Europe, and they need to have good relations with the US. Nevertheless, with this position, Russia, China, they're concerned that there might be a backlash. I think they were initially surprised at the strength of the sanctions against Russia in regard to what happened with Ukraine. And this is what China fears the most, that the West would all band together and have sanctions on them. And there's such a huge economy that would really frighten them. So I think now there's going to be a diplomatic tap dance. They are still with Putin. They abstained from the UN Security Council, and I'm annoyed how some journalists are saying this is a big win for everybody. No, for China, the #1 foreign policy issue is sovereignty. An invasion of Ukraine is an invasion of, it's a destroying sovereignty issue. And this is something that's #1 for China. So they're willing to turn a blind eye to that because they have this entente with Russia. In addition to that, your students, and I heard your professor speak, so I know you might be familiar with some of these issues about, I'm so tired, I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up. Budapest or Bucharest? Budapest Memorandum from 1994. And the US, UK, and Russia gave security assurances that as long as Ukraine would give up their nuclear weapons, they would give them security assurances. Well, this is what happens when you give up your nuclear weapons, could be a conclusion that a country like North Korea could draw from this, or Iran. So I think that this has huge implications for all of us in regards to non-proliferation issues. And when I said that China is the biggest winner no matter what, Russia is already a junior partner to China. But now we're all familiar with the Matryoshka doll. Now I think they're down to the smallest bit in the box. And so Russia is going to be so dependent on China, so dependent on their markets. These sanctions are going to hurt, they're going to bite. And so China will be able to extract better deals from Russia, lower prices in energy, maybe special deals in the Arctic. China is a near-Arctic power, self-described, but they have big plans for the Arctic, and Russia might have to give way in certain areas. Their relationship is imperfect, there are certain tensions, but they might have to be looked over, maybe Russia will have to park some of those on a shelf in order to continue to get some support from China. And if China understands Russia has no other place to go, they can extract better deals from them. So, as Russia's superpower, I like to say, is a disruptor. China has had investments in Ukraine, and they like stability. So it's a tough road for China to walk. And in the past, I've seen them take this mediator role because they want Europe to like them. They don't want to be kind of tarred with a Russia brush. But I think that you might see them speaking out of both sides of their mouth, telling everyone, and I think it's so bad in Ukraine, I would be happy and delighted if China could help bring peace there. More power to them, that would be great. But I think they're doing dual messaging. They're sending two different messages to the world, and they're hoping that the public won't notice how close they really are to Russia.
Thank you very much. Several days ago, there was an article in Foreign Affairs in the journal saying how the West was getting together, was joining forces to face the challenges of coming from China. It sort of said that once you have identified an enemy, it's much easier to join forces. And that idea that the West is completely fragmented was being challenged by this fact. Funnily enough, we've seen how that has rushed off with the Russia attack on Crimea, on Ukraine, sorry. Because it's when you really see the enemy very, very close, then everyone comes together.
I'll just make it quick.
Sure.
And I'll keep it short. I think that's where the miscalculation was for both Russia and China. And China has a benefit of watching what happened with Russia, and this will feed down into their calculus in regard to Taiwan. So from that point of view, they're like, oh my gosh, the West is really getting together, the sanctions are biting, and this might change Xi's calculus on Taiwan. So that could be one of the positive out of this whole mess that we're in.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Josep now about the new strategic concept of NATO. And I mean, this is a very simple question, but how can we really draw a new strategic concept, which is aimed to last several years? As David was mentioning, the last one was drawn in 2010. How can we do it when we don't really know how the world is going to look like in 2 months? Is it possible to draw a strategic concept with all these uncertainties?
Well, definitely, this will not be easy at all. And actually, a group of experts were preparing this document for discussion and approval later this year. We don't know exactly what we will find there, but surely there must be an explicit reference to China, how we intend to relate with China. China is going to remain a great power for several years or decades, and we need to define what kind of relationship we want to have with them and how defensive or offensive we want to project our image towards them, right? In this sense, I think that something which shouldn't change in years or decades would be the kind of relationship between EU members and also NATO members. Many of them are the same. And we've had this experience, and I take the opportunity here to state something which is which may be sometimes misread, I would say. I'm not too sure that we are in the end of the Western liberal order as we've known it. For sure, as we've known it since 1990. But, the world was somehow under a liberal order from 1945, partially. Half of the world was not participating actively in this order. We know now, we have the experience of the kind of relationship that the United States and Western Europe and Europe at large and some other countries may maintain for decades. So this would be for sure one pillar that shouldn't change in the mid-term or long run. And I agree with the idea that it is very difficult to calculate how things are going to be in 10, 20 years. But we know that some of the changes and transformations that we've experienced, they are here to stay for some time. And it is in the face of these continuities that we have to define our position as Western liberal democracies, I would say, through these institutions.
Thank you, Josep. And my final question in this round to David, you've talked a lot about deterrence, and until again, everything since we seem to have gone back to I don't know 30 years ago, because I learned at school that deterrence was based on nuclear power. Then we seem to have forgotten that, and nuclear was not a deterrence issue anymore. Deterrence was not an issue anymore, and suddenly nuclear is there again with a very bad face. What kind of world are we building? I mean, how serious do you think is the threat of Russia of using nuclear, a nuclear possibility in this conflict?
Well, I think this idea that the nuclear weapons almost disappear from strategic thinking, I think it was a groupthink. Everyone was, in that time, agree with the end of the the history, the famous Fukuyama argument. And but there were people that didn't believe on that, Samuel Huntington, John Marsheimer, and if you follow the rationality of his arguments, and then after 30 years, they were right. And a lot of things these people said in that moment happened. Why? Because I think it was a very good argument. Okay, this expansion of international liberal order, and everyone was very happy with that. Even the Chinese looks like very happy with that. But to the end, there are several problems with all these ideas, because at the end, everything depends on one superpower and a second tier of great powers that was in the Western world. And at the end, for Russia, for instance, even from the weakness point of view, because Russia is weak economically, even militarily, we can see that now. One of the options for Russia is maintaining a military doctrine with maintaining the tactical nuclear weapons as probably a tool in certain moments. In the imminent military defeat or the invasion of Russia, the military doctrine is going to use tactical nuclear weapons. And we don't talk about that very much in Western countries, not even in NATO. And the rise of the Chinese nuclear arsenal, the rise of the India, Pakistan, etc. And then in a Cold War world with this MAD, mutual assured destruction balance, well, it was more or less manageable. But now it's very, very difficult to know what is the moment of escalation and the risks of escalation for a country in a certain moment of certain defeat. Well, I'm not talking about Russia in this case, but this is the world in which we are living now. And I think we have to put again this thinking in the strategic thinking as it was in the Cold War. Because I think now it's worse. Because we have for example, cyber attacks. You can try an offensive cyber attack on command and control nuclear weapons, and then you are going to push the country or the government to use or lose. And this is new, completely new in a strategic realm. And then all these kind of things are very important for us in order to maintain strategic stability. And then that's why I think there was a failure of deterrence, not only through nuclear weapons or conventional weapons, but all the mechanism, all the means the Western world had to deter and use deterrence with Russia. Because I think to a certain point, we can forecast the movement in certain moment, the movements of Russia, and the alliance with China. This is terrible. The alliance with China, Russia, China. It's like in the 50s. Change the position. But it's the same. And when we talk about international liberal order, well, Russia and China is using the international liberal order, but I'm not committed with international liberal order. That's my main argument. No, of course, the international liberal order has not disappeared, but it's different that you are committed, you believe in, you are promote his values, etc., etc. And well, I'm going to use this because it's strategically for me, it's okay. And I think that this is at the end, this is my point of view. Okay.
I think we can open now the floor to all of you. Those of you in the room that want to ask something, please raise your hand. I'm not sure whether we have a microphone. Yeah, it's over there. And those of you in the virtual world, some of you have already started to send your questions. I would like to give the floor, if she's there, I don't see her, to Gabriela Coca, who had a question. Gabriela, do you want to ask your question in person, or shall I do it? Ah, no puede. Sí, sí está. So we wanted to give you the protagonism here, but with some technical issues. Gabriela, do you want to ask your question? Okay, if not, I'll do it. Yeah,
Hello?
Here she is. We don't see you.
Okay.
We can hear you, but we don't see you.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, hello. I get a little bit nervous. Could these sanctions to Russia be some sort of a boomerang? For instance, I don't know if you're able to hear me because I don't have a good internet. But I was wondering if these sanctions to Russia could be some sort of boomerang in somehow making Russia be part of the CIPS, the payment system of China, the China international payment system. And the same question regarding commerce, if there's any chance Russia could be part of the RCEP, the Regional Economic, I believe is the Comprehensive Partnership. I don't know if the questions were clear.
Thank you. Who wants to go first? Josep, maybe you can start to answer?
Yeah, well, for sure we're going to pay, we are going to receive as a boomerang part of the sanctions we impose on Russia. But either we accept this cost or we wait for a bigger cost in the future. I think we have experience and we know what would happen if we accept this idea that you can invade another country as if that was like a normal practice back in the first half of the 20th century or in the 19th century. The world has changed. It is not like in the past. I think we are, what we have here is a very interesting exercise or a very interesting situation in which different understandings of the world coexist. And I don't think those with a more liberal perspective on world politics are naive. But I think that things have changed, and the world is not the great power politics of the 19th century that is in the mind of Putin and some other people around Putin. Europe is something different from what it was in the mid 20th century, and yes, I think we are going to pay some of this price as a boomerang now with the sanctions. But I think that this is much better than waiting for a much higher cost in the future. We have no guarantee that what has happened in Ukraine cannot happen in some other places nearby, in Moldova, in Georgia, in other places. This is not like the first episode in a strategic plan that we've been witnessing from Russia or from the Russian government in the past 15 years or so.
Thank you. Theresa, David, Raquel, do you want to add anything?
Well, I'm not sure about sanctions as a boomerang, but probably it's a boomerang because and we are the guilty of that is ours, no? Because we offer to Russia the options to that sanctions were a boomerang. I mean, in terms of energy, for instance, no, offering to the Russians the options to hijack us with gas and other issues. And then that is, I think, the point. And this is necessary in the European Union about all to rethink about this very seriously and look for options not only gas, no? I'm talking about even nuclear energy. No? Some people don't talk about that because to say this is something, but it's not the case, for instance, in France. No? France has been working a lot and fighting a lot for nuclear energy. Then, looking for these kind of options and thinking strategically about these issues, probably the problem sections. I am talking only about energy, but we can talk about more issues. No, thank you.
Thank you. I think that it is clear one thing that appeasement doesn't work with Russia during those years. We can think in 2008 with Georgia, 2014 with the Crimea, and now with this invasion of Ukraine. So appeasement doesn't work. We have other tools in international. Our international system has another tools such as sanctions and. As David just said, of course that our weak problem is energy in these days, but we need to take these issues and the other ones seriously. And I think, for instance, in the strategy of the national government of Spain about energy, the national strategy on energy, and we identified the problems in a properly way, but then we didn't have the tools or maybe also the capabilities to find solutions. So I think that, the Western countries, we know which problems we have, but we know how to solve them.
Theresa?
I think the previous speakers covered a lot of my points, but I'll just say that the Germans had a saying called, which was part of Ostpolitik, Chancellor Willy Brandt's looking eastward, and it was Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. So this idea that the more we traded with Russia, and they use the same phrase with China, by the way, the more we trade with them, the more they'll be like us. And this has proven to be a bankrupt idea. And I think that that's going to be thrown on the ash heap of history for Germany right now after Chancellor Scholz's speech on Sunday. So this creates a whole rethink on how Germany, which is the largest and obviously the most influential country, especially in regards to making policy on China. Germany's a little more, position on Russia is a little more complicated. But I also think that the idea of trade is just great, we don't have to think strategically, has been completely disproven. With the pipeline politics of the 80s, when the USSR was building their first major pipelines to Europe, they were kind of warned not to become more than 25% dependent on Soviet energy. And now we see Germany is 60% reliant on Russian energy. And I think that, I don't care who your neighbor is, that's not a good lever for them to have over you. So you need to diversify your energy resources. And I think that there's a huge rethink on this. And we saw this in the German Chancellor Scholz's speech on Sunday, where he announced also that they're going to be building 2 major LNG plants. So that way, degasification plants, liquefied natural gas port stations. So this means that they'll have the ability not just to get energy from Russia overland, but they can actually import from the gas spot market that's international. And I think you also made a question about RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And from what I understand from economists, that this is kind of so watered down that it won't really make that much of a difference. It means all things to all people. But one of the things that I think Beijing is going to really push hard for now with Russia and sanctions is the internationalization of the renminbi. This is one of their key asks. It's hard for them to do, but we're seeing increased trade in energy from Russia to China being paid for in rubles rather than the dollar. So I think that China will try to advance and use this to their benefit. So I think that's coming down the pipeline too.
Thank you. Let me now give the floor to Matthias Diaz Roqueta. He is a student at Pompeu Fabra University, and he was the winner of one of the winners of the competition last year with a piece on NATO, the Mediterranean, and the new security networks. Matthias, please, can you share some insights with us?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all the people who is in the room for this magnificent conversation. They've been having. And yeah, Defensa y Yo is such a wonderful program. I invite everyone in the room who's following online or face-to-face just to participate in the competition, because if you're lucky and you do a good work and you're selected, it's going to be seriously an experience that you will remember for all of your life, because you get to know so many inspiring people, and you get to meet top-ranking officials in Madrid, in Brussels. You get to visit, embassies, military bases. So I think it's a magnificent experience, and if you can take part of that, as I said, you will remember forever. And I just want to give my opinion here on why programs such as Defensa y Yo are so important and so key and paramount for Europe and for the Allies. And the other day, I remembered I saw a poll by Harris, which is a United States poller, that asked, do Russian grievances about NATO justified invading Ukraine? And 74% said no, and 26% say yes. But if we look in the young people between 18 and 34 years, 47% of them agrees. That's almost half of them. So this gives you an idea of how important it is for this culture of defense to be spread between the young people. Because what we are doing with Ukraine now, providing resources, just helping them resist the Russian invasion, if we do not do a serious work in the Western world, culturally and with our education resources, we will not be able to do it in 20 years or 30 years, not because we don't have the military resources or the economic power or the technology, but because our public opinion will not be for it. So just wrapping up, I think Defensa y Yo is a great opportunity, and please get involved in the competition, do your best, and I hope to meet you in person very soon.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And I invite you to, before joining the competition, to make questions here, those of you who are in the room. Since we are running out of time, let me pick up 3 questions together. So I'm now going to give the floor to Nuria Dobos, who's online. Nuria, please.
Hola. Hi, everyone. So since we're talking about the relationships between China and the EU, I wanted to ask about what are the effects that happen from the tension that it has been between Lithuania and China since of the theme of Taiwan.
Thank you, Nuria. Let me pick up 3 questions, and then I'll give you the floor to answer. Josep, you too. Sorry, I wanted to invite now Gisa. Sorry, I lost your name.
Hi, I don't know if you
can
hear me.
Gisa Pavone. Sorry, I didn't see it. Here you are.
Wait. Okay, now I hear you. Hi. Oh wait, I think my Wi-Fi went off. I'm so sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can see you but
yeah,
go ahead.
I think something happened with my video. But yeah, so I was wondering something about what Theresa was talking about, like China is playing this safe field where they're trying to maintain the relations with
the EU and as well as with Russia. But I was wondering what has to happen with Russia or with China or with the EU for China to be forced to change that one-sided option of only supporting Russia under the table, but do it like directly or the other way around, to stop supporting Russia and accept that they cannot commerce with them if they want to stay in relation with the West.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. And now I'm going to read another question from someone in the chat. From a European perspective, where does the US stand in the international scenario as an actor? And do the participants think these events could be a crucial point in order to build a European common security policy? So I'll leave it there. Who wants to go first? Maybe Josep?
Okay, I don't know if I'm really the best person to answer some of these questions, but let me state a couple of general issues. The first thing is that sometimes with some of your adversaries or with those with whom you interact, whatever you do, they have a plan. They are not going to change their plan. I don't think we are in a position to substantially alter some of the moves that China has already planned and decided with a more strategic view. China has grown for decades. China has a series of resources that no other country in the world can have. And we know economically that it will surpass us very soon, even the United States, maybe by the mid-21st century. So there are some things that we won't change about the decisions other actors have already taken. In relation to another question to the EU, I think it is important to state that we can be partly what we want to be. With the same resources, we may decide to stand out, to have a firm stance in front of some events or processes, or we may decide to have another weaker or shallower stance. And I think that the European Union is in a crucial moment to somehow regain some of the confidence and some of the strategic visions that during the 90s projected the European integration process as we knew it. We've lived a couple of decades of, I don't know if say decadence of the European Union. Maybe that's a good time to rethink about our strength and the need to stand united in front of some practices and some stances. And these may also affect the role between Lithuania and China, but I will not enter into this question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Theresa, your reaction?
Wow, the decadence of the EU. I say that quietly at home, so I'm impressed that you mentioned that out loud. Okay. But we have to remember, China has worked. When we lived in China and when my family, we moved back to Brussels, my kids said, when do people go to school? Because in China, they went to school 6 days a week, and they worked very, very hard. And in Europe, they had Friday off and Wednesday half day. And my son quite honestly said, when do they learn, Mom? But then he got very quickly accustomed to his new schedule in Belgium. But going back to your question about Lithuania, my point is that China has worked very hard. They have, they've lifted, it's not because the Chinese Communist Party lifted people out of poverty. They don't do that. It was that the Chinese people themselves worked really, really hard. And I think that we should keep that in mind. In regard to Lithuania, that's a fantastic question, Nuria. I think that this is the canary in the coal mine about Chinese economic coercion. We haven't seen this before in Europe. Of course, what I call preemptive obedience. They don't tell you, what you can and can't do, but you have to kind of guess. And there's a fantastic author named Perry Link, who wrote an essay, and it's free, it's online, it's a brilliant essay, and he calls it the anaconda in the chandelier. So you see this giant snake in the chandelier, and as an academic or anyone in government, you see it, and you don't know if it's going to come down and bite you, but it's always hanging up there in the chandelier, and you see it. So he talked about this kind of threat that's always there, but you never know when it might strike. So Lithuania is their strike, because they crossed for Beijing. They called an office Taiwan office, even though in Beijing there is a Taiwan office, and they asked them to change it to Taipei office. In addition to that, Lithuania left the 17+1. That's that regional grouping I talked about earlier. So they were the first country to leave. And it's really dangerous. So if you guys go into politics, don't call a group by a number. Don't call it 17+1, because then it's 16+1 or 15+1, and then you look bad. So just give it a name. And so I think this is what they're worried about, like a domino effect. And so they needed to punish Lithuania to kind of, there's a saying in Chinese, kill a chicken to scare the monkey. And I call Lithuania the chicken, and the really big monkey is Germany. So they're trying to frighten the rest of Europe to behave. And I think that Lithuania is a small country. Only 1% of their economy is with trade with China. And what happened when they were being punished? All of a sudden, on the databases for your Chinese trade, there's no word Lithuania. Because there are certain rules you follow when you're a member of the World Trade Organization, which China is a member of. But so they just kind of do these things that are gray zone behavior that it's hard to create a lawsuit. And they're like, no, there's no Lithuania. So you couldn't export goods or import things from China into Lithuania. Other EU member states tried to help them, and Beijing said, now we're going to Europeanize this problem, and anyone who buys components from Lithuania, if they're in their supply chains, you will be punished. So that meant for the German car industry, which sources components from Lithuania, Lithuania has a lot of German investment there, and Germany panicked. They said, you better get your relationship better with Beijing, otherwise it's going to hurt our economy, and we're going to pull our investments out of Lithuania. So instead of showing solidarity, other EU member states, particularly Germany, kind of warned Lithuania. But then they asked for help and support. There is an anti-coercion instrument that was drafted before this happened with Lithuania. But because of these tensions, it's actually accelerated. Now, the question is, the EU has all these handy tools. Do they use them in the toolbox? And will it be something that China will say, if you use the anti-coercion instrument on us, we will punish you further? So it's becoming a very difficult situation. And I think this, because of China's, oops, that's interesting. Because of China's anti-coercion, because they're such a huge trade partner for the key economy in Europe, Germany, they have a lot of power and sway. So we understand, the German car industry, they sell more cars in China than they do in other markets. So we have to keep this in mind. And I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I do want to just add this idea of systemic rivalry. In 2019, the EU came up with a multifaceted approach. So they used 3 baskets to describe China. One is a partner, one is a competitor, and the other is a systemic rival. And so many Chinese officials, business people tried to get the Europeans to drop the label systemic rival because they want to head off this kind of negative view. But and that would go back to the discourse power and this kind of idea of how they can control the narrative. And I just want to pull this thread through all the way, because earlier in this discussion, you talked about how both Russia and China say that they have better democracies, and that even in authoritarian regimes, the pull of democracy is so attractive that they will bend themselves into pretzel shapes to say, we really are a democracy, and we're a better democracy than the rest. So I think that that's really important to keep in mind. Thanks.
Thank you. David?
Well, it's incredible because few people in Spain, I think, have been following what happened between Lithuania and China. And I was talking a lot with my students last quarter about the economic coercion of China with Australia during the last years. It has been amazing what happened with the Australians and China all the time. And but it's also a thing that most of the people in Spain don't know. all of them don't care that sometimes this is worse. No, and what happened. I would like to use a little bit my PowerPoint, if I may, because it's very long, but don't worry, because I'm going to only to choose one. You see, I have a lot of things to use, but it's okay. Oh, wow. Yeah. That's it. It was very interesting. Well, this movie. And it's a kind of example of the control of narrative. This is a movie, in your life it's read down. This is a movie from the 80s in the high peak of the Cold War. What happened in the movie? In the movie, there is a parachuters, Cubans that invade the United States and then fall in the middle, in the center of the United States, and a group of teenagers are going to create a guerrilla and fight against the Cubans and the Russians, etc. Okay, very interesting. In the second movie, that is the same. It's a remake from 2012. What happened? Happened the same. But what is the problem? The problem that it was 2010, the movie was intended that the enemy invading the United States were the Chinese. Well, if you see the movie now, the enemy are the North Koreans. Chinese government put pressure on the producers, and the producers digitally had to change everything in the movie, changing from Chinese to North Koreans. This happened in 2012. I'm not talking, even previous to the arrival of Xi Jinping. And this is very interesting, and I use like an sample. I have plenty of samples in the PowerPoint, but don't worry. But why I'm saying that, I would like to finish with this. You can imagine the control of the narrative of a government of the country that is able to change that. It's a movie that was ready to the premiere, and then say, no way, you have to change this and to put in all the images the North Koreans instead of the Chinese. I have more photos, but it's okay. And then can imagine, you think the country able to do that? And what happened with the Western countries that accept that? And this is at the end the problem of the Western countries, and how to react to that. That was the only thing I want to say.
Thank you very much. I have Professor Francisco Rodriguez, who is in DC these days, who wants to make a question. And I also have here Felipe Timmerman and Antonio Varela, but I'm going to make those questions instead of, because we are running out of time. So Francisco, please, you can ask your question or make your comment, and then I'll read the other two. Sorry, by the way, someone was telling me that the image, the picture that David just showed, people there on the screen couldn't see it. It was the cartels of the posters of two movies, as he described, Red Dawn, in different versions. If you couldn't see it, we may share it with you via the chat, I guess. We can take a screenshot. Okay, Francisco, please.
Good afternoon there. Thank you very much, Cristina and U.S. Embassy for organizing this. We are also participants of this program with the University of Salamanca. Well, my question, more than a question, is a thought. Someone said that when a war started, we should start thinking about the next one. Why I say that? When it comes to narrative and when it comes to how both parties have explain their goals and their projects before, like from a decade ago or so, I found very disappointed the clashing narrative and the clashing understanding of the event. For instance, I'm thinking of the misuse of history for both Russia and Ukraine when it comes, let's say, to Stefan Bandera, that national hero from San Ukrainian and very hated figure from the Russia. In other words, we should think about how we try, I know it's hard, but how we try to come to terms with historical narratives, because the use or misuse of past by politicians is very risky. We can see now the demonization of the enemy in both sides. Of course, I don't want to say that I'm blind to accept Russia propaganda, but it's true that on the other spectrum, sometimes we exaggerate. And in that way, it's very hard to find a kind of middle ground or a way to advance into a peaceful negotiation or a peaceful agreement. I know that this could sound as a naive statement and a dream, but it's so serious, the situation, that we should try to make those middle ground approach to historical events. That's it.
Thank you very much. Felipe Timmerman was commenting on energy and the prices of energy and how Europe is dependent, and you were saying just a minute ago, how Germany is dependent on Russians, oil and gas, mostly gas. His question is if the US could be one of the main candidates to replace Russia, and how that would impact the cost of living for Europeans. And and if so, whether the nuclear energy could be a good option for Europeans. That is a question from Felipe Timmerman. Then Antonio Varela asks whether the sanctions and restrictions, whether being too hard on restrictions with Russia can lead to an offensive response, and what kind of future do you foresee for our relationships with Russia? I mean the West. And then Gloria Bean asks about Transnistria being a pro-Russia territory in Moldova, and since it doesn't belong to NATO, whether Moldova can face the same risk as Ukraine is facing. I would leave it there because we are already over the time. So who wants to go first? I just launched all the questions together with Francisco's comments. So please.
I'll take the energy one really quickly. The U.S. has fracking, but that requires a certain high level. And so I think that with Iran, if the peace deal does go through, or the JCPOA, the new agreement goes through, Iran will be an additional source of fuel. And I think for security, it's good to have multiple. You want to diversify as much as possible. I think you can get more from the Middle East, more from Africa. I think that these would be key areas. And then, of course, with Iran, you could do swap agreements. But since I know the clock is ticking, I'll just make one last comment, because I know you're students and you're probably familiar with Mackinder, the father of geopolitics. And he talked about the world island. So with this kind of China-Russia cooperation, we see, this kind of Eurasian landmass. Whoever can control that, according to Mackinder, can have the most power in the world. So we're seeing this incredible cooperation. And I would add, when Xi Jinping came to Belgium and spoke at the College of Europe, he said, "I feel so close to you. You're in my neighborhood." And I thought that was so fascinating, that that's how Xi Jinping saw Belgium. He saw it as close, saw them as their neighbor. So I think the number one takeaway from the tectonic shift is that the geopolitical change is China is really top dog now, and Russia is the junior partner to them. And I think that what we should be concerned about, because I know in Spain, geography is destiny. Maybe you don't feel so close to the conflict, what's happening in Ukraine, but there's a real danger of spillage. For example, there's a lot of weapons going through Poland. That's becoming the hub to send lethal aid to Ukraine. And a Polish truck that crosses the border and is in Ukraine and gets hit by a missile, that's one thing. But a Polish truck in Poland that gets hit by a missile, now you're in World War III, you've got Article 5. So I think that we're really in an extremely dangerous period, and I think that we all need to pay attention and keep in mind why we have these defense agreements for security. It's like the insurance policy that everybody needs, especially in times of stress like this. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Josep?
Yes, I can pick up on the issue of narratives, which is a very interesting one. And I think it stresses to what extent discourse and practice in politics go hand in hand, but analytically, they should be distinguished. You know, in conflicts like the one we are witnessing in Ukraine, yes, we have diverse narratives, but there is one common narrative that we shouldn't abandon from the European perspective, even from the world perspective. In the General Assembly, a resolution has been adopted, which simply states that there is a norm according to which states cannot be occupied by other states. That's part of a narrative. This is a norm which shapes narratives, and we should stick to this narrative. I don't think we are in a proper position to find a middle way between historical narratives by different groups with their own interests, but I think this narrative of norms and institutions that have been accepted by all parties in the conflict should guide us somehow. And we can connect this with the issue of the effects of sanctions. If you adopt sanctions, you have to be ready to assume what effects they will have. It would be of no use from the European perspective or the American perspective to adopt economic sanctions without going as far as necessary on this field. Not in the military field, but on the economic field. If you adopt sanctions, you have to be ready to go as far as necessary. And I don't know if Russia will be more or less aggressive because of the sanctions, but there is no need to threat with sanctions if you don't effectively adopt them. And I don't think anyone, I take the opportunity to say, I don't think anyone really knows what happens in the minds of Putin and Lavrov. They are in a sort of bubble in this inner circle of the Russian government. We don't know how things are processed and how decisions are taken, but we know what we want, and I think we have to be consistent with our own views.
Thank you very much, David.
Well, I'm not entering very much, but I would like to, because we are not talking a lot about NATO. Then I'm going to, well, at the end, I think it's very problematic, the issue of deterrence, of course, and the issue of reassurance, by allies. And in fact, I think the most important issue here is how NATO, if is able to demonstrate capability and credibility, is going to produce a good strategic concept. But for that, I think the allies need to focus more common ground. The issue of what has been happening in Europe and across the world, I think in the last years has been that. We are very too much debated. We don't have these ideas that we maintained during the Cold War, the general interest and the general values, something that was the main issue for Western world. And then I think we had to talk more about that in NATO in terms of political will and not only military capability, but also political will. I think this is the most important, and it's why we open these debates about the middle ground. When a country invades another one, I think there is no middle ground. It's something that is an aggressor and something that is suffering the invasion. And then I'm not going to sustain a middle ground. I'm going to defend the people that is being invaded, and That's why we create NATO for this kind of situation. I think it's very important, and probably this is not a very academic point of view, it's more a political speech where I'm doing, but this is true. And then we had to think a little bit more about NATO and the ability of the allies to maintain this credibility, this capacity. Then NATO and the Western world is going to work very well, and then this is not going to happen again, I think.
Thank you, David. Raquel?
Thank you. I want to say some things. One regarding NATO. It's true that Ukraine wake up NATO, and we will see what will happen in Madrid in June. However, we need to pay attention also to the southern flank. I mean, now obviously all the attention is focusing in the east, but we will have problems also in the south. Yesterday was these problems in Melilla and Ceuta. I know that both of that cities, they are not not covered by the treaty, but we will have problems still in the south. And I remember 1 year ago when we're talking about, and we explain all the threats coming from the south. And then regarding also the interesting reflection that doing the professor of Salamanca University, I think that the problem is that we have rules and we believe in that rules, and I mean Russia and China and this class of narratives, they using our tools, but they didn't have or didn't believe in our values. So also with the pandemic, for instance, we see the differences, and of course that we are not fighting with the same rules. So this is, for that reason, I think that is more difficult.
Thank you both for bringing NATO back. We kind of forgot what we were here for. Thank you all for your comments and for sharing your insights with all of us. Just let me share another comment. There is a book by this intellectual Bruno Maschais, which is called The Dawn of Eurasia, just linking to what you were saying, Theresa, and how this big, huge continent will be, in his view, a key player in the future, not just because of China, also because of Europe. So this shifting power balances in the world. Anyhow, thank you again for sharing your insights, comments, and knowledge with all of us. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you all who are on the other side of the screen. I also want to thank Virginia, our translator, who's been doing a great job. And of course, I want to thank the Embassy for partnering with us. I also invite you all to participate in the competition. Just a reminder, you know that if you want to participate, you have to attend 2 of these debates. This is the second one. There are still 4 to go, very interesting ones also. And I also invite you to follow esglobal, because we keep covering all these issues day and day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.